mentioned in my earlier talk that the revolutionary government replaced all the traditional provinces of France with new departments, and one of the departments established in 1789 was the Vendée. The Vendée is the name of a somewhat insignificant river in the new department. The counter-revolutionary rising, which took place in 1793, was known as the Grande Guerre de la Vendée, the Great War of the Vendée. The war was not confined to this department, but spilled over into the neighboring departments of the Loire-Inférieure, Maine-et-Loire, and Deux-Sèvres. This area is referred to by historians as La Vendée Militaire, the military Vendée. In the account of the rising which follows, the term Vendée refers to the Vendée Militaire and not simply to the department of that name. Most historians, of course, don't mention the Vendée in English-speaking countries or in France. It's a non-event. It would have been in Orwell's 1984. It just never happened because everybody was so happy with the French Revolution. Why would anybody have wanted to oppose it? The actual department of the Vendée is a vast territory of more than 12,000 square kilometres, comprising of parts of three of the most ancient French provinces, Anjou, Brittany and Poitou. At the end of the 18th century, much of the territory was covered with dense woodlands, deep valleys, moors, heaths and rivers. The large area known as the Bocage, wooded region, in the centre of the department contained only two metal thoroughfares. Communication between villages was confined to tracks, often dating back to prehistoric times, with high banks overshadowed by trees and bushes, perfect country for guerrilla warfare. It was a region inhabited largely by peasant farmers engaged in intensive agriculture and was an important source of food for Paris. The department was one of very contrasting regions with contrasting characteristics among the people who inhabited them. The Vendée Militaire was certainly the most Catholic region in the whole of France. The people were devoted to their priests, who were frequently members of families living in the very parishes they served. There was no greater honour for a Vendéan peasant family than to have a son become a priest. Between the priest and the peasant, there was no rivalry, mistrust, or conflict. The people not only loved and looked up to their priests, but expected them to be worthy of respect. The people were, in general, equally devoted to the nobility, in a manner that was unique for the whole of France. Complaints of unjust or absentee landlords were unknown in the Vendée. The aristocrats did not burden their peasants with unjust taxes, and in fact they had not exercised their feudal privileges since the 17th century. It was the general practice for the curé, the parish priest, to announce from the pulpit hunts organised by the lords on their own estates, and to invite the peasants to take part. This was a gesture unique to the Vendée. There was practically no crime in the region. There were very few lawsuits. It was a bad place for lawyers to live. And there was an exceptionally high rate of literacy for rural France at this time, which was thanks almost entirely to the zeal of the clergy. The people of the Vendée were outraged when their priests were required to take the oath of loyalty to the revolutionary constitution. Only 1 in 6 of the clergy in the Vendée took the oath, and of those who did, many later recanted. The fact that 5 out of every 6 priests refused to take the oath is truly amazing in view of the fact that a refusal to do so meant an immediate loss of income. And as you know, to all traditional Catholic clergy, income is something that really matters. But so that shows that's a great sacrifice to begin with. They were prepared to forego their income in the interests of the faith. Clergy, as I told you this morning, who took the oath were called the juring clergy, jurors, or constitutional priests. Those who refused the oath were the non-juring clergy, or non-jurors. The word juror is derived from the French verb jurer, to take an oath. The juring clergy were referred to by the Vendéens as intrus, which means intruders, which was usually abbreviated as trout or trouton. So if they saw a juring priest come in, they say, "Look at that so-and-so trout." These intruding clergy, they were foreigners where the Vendéens were concerned, from cities such as Paris, and they were intruded into a country that was not their own, and into parishes where nobody wanted them. The non-juring clergy were referred to by the Republicans as réfractaires, which means refractory, stubborn, or rebellious. The government not only alienated the entire peasant population of the Vendée by persecuting their beloved non-juring clergy, but by attempting to impose the despised jurors upon parishes that did not want them. Non-juring priests warned their people to shun the intruding juror, l'intrus, who would eventually replace him. They warned young couples to be married before the intrus arrived, since any marriages that he conducted would not be valid as the Pope had deprived him of his jurisdiction. The missionary order of the Mulotins, founded by St. Louis-Marie Grignon de Montfort, who lived from 1673 to 1716, was particularly active in persuading the faithful not to accept the juring priests. The preaching of this saint and his priests had played no little part in ensuring that the Vendéens were the most fervent Catholics in France. The National Assembly sent juring clergy into the Vendée from Paris and other large cities. Resentment towards them was so great that they frequently needed an armed escort of National Guards to escort them to their installation, through crowds of parishioners shouting, "Ne jurez pas, ne vous damnez pas," "Do not take the oath, do not damn yourself." When a juring priest was able to take possession of his new parish, he might well find that his predecessor had taken all the sacred vessels, mass vestments, and keys. What the priest could not take with him, the people hid. Juring priests were hooted at, jeered at, and even kicked when they appeared in public. The faithful would not assist at the mass of a juring priest, as they considered their church to have been profaned by his very presence. When the Abbé Pierre from Paris was installed as the parish priest of May-sur-Èvre, he was followed into the church by women who scrubbed the stone floor everywhere he had put his feet, because they believed his footsteps had polluted their church. Assisting at the mass of a juring priest was considered to be an endorsement of the revolution. No peasant wanted to be seen even in the presence of a juror, since he was considered to be a carrier of a spiritual plague. Children who made their first communion with him were said to have become food for the devil. Parents of newly born children would refuse to have them baptized by juring priests, and would be literally marched to the church at gunpoint by National Guards. These National Guards, who were probably atheists, would have to act as godfathers, since no one else would be present. National Guards also had to act as servers, crucifers, or candle bearers during the Mass, as the sacristan and altar boys refused to be present. The position of the intrus was not helped by the fact that the non-juring curé would often stay in or near his parish, usually hiding in the homes of parishioners. He exhorted his people to resist the government and the intrus, and he offered Mass for them in secret. Another means widely adopted to outwit the government was to multiply the already numerous and very popular local pilgrimages. The faithful would march along the country lanes, usually at night, to pray at roadside shrines and chapels, where, by a planned coincidence, they would happen to meet their non-juring curé, who would administer the sacraments to them. The immediate cause of the Vendéan uprising was the decree of the General Assembly of the 24th of February 1793 that 300,000 men were to be conscripted into the revolutionary army. News of the September massacres had reached the remotest villages, and the Vendéens were still in a state of shock at the murder of the king, the good king, le bon roi, only a few weeks before. The very idea of joining the army of a regime which persecuted good priests, attacked religion, and had killed the good king was one which these exemplary Catholics would not so much as consider. The Vendéens resented the fact that their able-bodied young men should be taken far away from the farms that needed their labor to fight with men with whom they had no quarrel, on behalf of those who were implacably opposed to every belief that they held dear. They resented the fact that the conscription decree was implemented by the bourgeoisie from the local town, who were themselves exempted from conscription because of the public offices that they held. These bourgeoisie were the same men who had bought up the best church lands at a premium when they had been nationalized in 1789. These were men who had been rich before the revolution and had been made even richer by the revolution at the expense of honest peasants and the church, to which the peasants gave their love and their loyalty. As one peasant expressed it, "They have killed our king, chased away our priests, sold the goods of our church, eaten everything they have, and now they want to take our bodies. No, they shall not have them." The tocsin sounded in 700 parishes. The tocsin was the alarm calling the faithful to arms. The Catholics of the Vendée rose as one man to fight for religion and the good king in what has been described as the last crusade. The rising was entirely spontaneous. It had not been planned in any way at all, even though the revolutionary authorities claimed that it had been instigated by the clergy and the nobles. The clergy and the nobility had, in most cases, been reluctant to encourage an armed rising. The Catholic peasants were not trained soldiers, and very few had any experience of actual warfare. The numbers grew in different localities by dozens, by hundreds, and eventually by thousands, and they sought out leaders mostly, but not exclusively, from among the aristocracy. Perhaps the most celebrated of the non-aristocratic leaders was Jacques Catalineau, known as the Saint of the Anjou. Catalineau was a Catalineau was a peddler, known throughout the wide region where he sold his wares at fairs, markets, and crossroads, in tiny hamlets and during village pilgrimages. He had not hesitated to denounce the revolution and everything connected with it, particularly the persecution of the church. On the 13th of March 1793, he told his fellow villagers at Panamauge that war could no longer be avoided. They must take up arms against the Republic, or the Vendée would be crushed. His wife begged him to change his mind. "Think of me," she implored, "and think of our 5 children. Do not be afraid," he assured her. "God, for whom I shall fight, will protect you." Catalineau armed himself with his rosary, a pistol, and a saber, pinned a badge of the Sacred Heart upon his tunic, and went out into the village square. During the 17th century, the whole of western France, as I told you, had been stirred by the missions of Saint Louis Marie Grignon de Montfort, and the red badge of the Sacred Heart, popularized by the saint, was to become the principal emblem of the Vendéan soldiers, together with the cocarde blanche, the white cockade, which was the symbol of legitimate Christian monarchy. The supporters of the Stuart monarchy in England wore the white cockade for the same reason. 27 young men were waiting for Catalineau. They went to pray in their church, which had been closed for a year because the curé had refused the oath. A beautiful bronze statue of Catalineau was erected outside the church in 1993. The original church was destroyed by the Republicans, but eventually rebuilt with a series of exquisite stained glass windows depicting important events in the history of the Rising. Dr. Bob and Tom Brown and myself were there just a few weeks ago. We made a tour of the Vendée, and I've got some pictures in this album taken by Dr. Bob, which I'd be happy to show anyone. There's a very nice picture of the statue of Catalineau. The peasants left the church with cries of "Vive la religion," long live religion, and marched to other villages to find recruits. By midday, their numbers had swollen to 500. Resolved to waste no time, Catalineau led his men to the small town of Jalais. "My friends," he exhorted them, "never forget that we are fighting for our holy religion." Following his example, the tiny army fell to its knees and intoned the Vexilla Regis. Vexilla Regis prodeunt fulgent Christis crucis mysterium. The banners of the King go forth, the mystery of the cross shines, by which our life bore death, and by death gave us life. They attacked immediately, armed for the most part with little more than cudgels and scythes. The town fell with very little resistance, and their numbers having grown to 2,000, they went on to take the town of Chemillé, although it was defended fiercely by 300 blues with 3 cannon. Catalineau's profoundly Catholic instinct was made clear when his first action after the capture of the town was to lead his men into the ancient Angevin church of Notre Dame to sing a Te Deum of thanksgiving. Peasant farmers, labourers and weavers had thus dared to do what both nobles and clergy had shrunk from, to take up arms against the forces of evil. I think it's a little reflection on our times that with universal Catholic education, even a committed group like you and myself included, if I asked you to get up now and sing the Te Deum by heart, there'd be very few people who could do it. Yet these peasants, they all knew the Vexilla Regis, the Te Deum, the Christus Vincit, they knew them all by heart. The most celebrated of all the Vendéan leaders was François-Anatole Charette de la Contrie, referred to invariably as Charette, which is lucky. We've been waiting for a long time for our cocktails, so I had to say his full name every time. He was born in 1763, the youngest of a family of 3 daughters and 7 sons. He was educated at the Oratorian College in Nantes, where he showed exceptional mathematical ability, joined the Navy in 1779, and was almost continually at war during his 9 years of service, including action alongside the revolutionaries in America. Charette was the least inclined of all the Vendéan leaders to integrate his forces totally into the Catholic and Royal Army. He was also far from inclined to involve himself in the uprising. As a professional military man, he probably realized that the possibility of a victory over the revolutionary forces was not great. It is even claimed that when a crowd of peasants arrived at his home to put him at their head, he hid beneath the bed to avoid them. He eventually agreed to speak to them, but refused outright to put himself at their head. "Be sensible," he urged them. "Return to your homes." Tempers became heated. Charette was accused of cowardice. "It is shameful," the peasants told him, "for an officer of the king to refuse to fight the enemies of God and the king." This was more than he could bear. "Very well then, if that's the way you want it, I accept. But you must accept my conditions. I will be the master, and when I command you will obey, and I will break the head of anyone who does not obey." Charette then took a solemn oath never to return to his home unless victorious or dead. He was particularly celebrated for the panache of the uniform he designed for himself. He wore a high-crowned hat with a narrow brim and 2 gold bands about it. The brim was turned up at the front by a clasp holding a white Bourbon plume. A very distinctive feature was the large white handkerchief with red spots worn under the hat, the famous mouchoir de Cholet, handkerchief from Cholet, which was adopted by most Vendéan generals. His coat was sometimes of hunting green, and at others of a bluer snuff colour, with a broad white sash, buckskin breeches and boots with brown tops. There's an excellent picture of Charette in my book, which I omitted to say all the pictures in the book have been done by Tom Brannan. He's probably embarrassed by my saying that, but they're the best thing in the book. But you can have a look at Charette's picture afterwards. A former Count General Marseille, this is a little point, most of the revolutionary armies were led by former aristocrats who renounced their titles and went over to the revolution. A former Count General Marseille was sent from La Rochelle to suppress the rising with 2,400 infantry and 100 cavalry. An experienced soldier, Marseille was apprehensive when he entered the wilderness of the Bocage, that's the wooded region. As evening fell near Saint-Vincent-Stellange on the 19th of March, hundreds of silhouettes appeared in the next valley. Marseille was about to order his troops to open fire when a subordinate cried out with excitement that they must be Republicans because they were singing the Marseillaise. What Marseille did not realize was that the Catholic army had composed its own anti-Republican version of the Republican hymn. By the time he realized that he was in the presence of the Catholic army, it was too late. The silhouettes vanished behind the hedges and into the ditches. Shots came ringing out from every direction. Cries of "Vive la religion, vive le roi" rang out, and the blues were put to flight. The Vendéans had by this time come to refer to all Republican troops as blues, professional soldiers as well as the despised National Guard. 500 blues and 200 peasants were buried the next day, and the Catholic army gained a large quantity of weapons. As the war progressed, the Catholic army equipped itself with weapons taken from the defeated blues. By the 21st of March, a good number of other towns and villages had been taken, and the Catholic and Royal Army could have captured without difficulty all the great cities of the region, Nantes, La Rochelle, Angers, and Tours. Napoleon has testified to the fact that they could have marched unopposed to Paris, taken it, and overthrown the revolution. But, as was almost invariably the case during the entire campaign, having won their victory, the peasants disbanded themselves and returned to their homes and their farms, on this occasion to prepare for Easter. Who are these Vendéans? Asked the deputies at the National Convention. On the 23rd of March 1793, the convention decided to end the uprising once and for all. An army of 35,000 professional soldiers was sent to wipe out the rebels. It was commanded by the former aristocrat, General Berryer, who travelled everywhere with a large retinue of cooks and servants. Berryer made the Vendéans furious by massacring the inhabitants of the village of Barret. On the 11th of April 1793, the outraged Catholics put Berrier's army to flight, capturing hundreds of prisoners. Not surprisingly, the Catholic soldiers wished to massacre their prisoners, just as the villagers of Barret had been massacred. The Catholic commander was Joseph-Louis Maurice d'Elbée, who had served as a regular soldier in the cavalry, but had retired to his small estate in the country in 1791 to live the life of an obscure country gentleman, apparently unconcerned with the political and religious crises surrounding him. A deputation of peasants visited d'Elbée at his chateau of La Loge to persuade him to command them. He was most unwilling to do so. His wife had just given birth to a child, relatives had arrived for the baptism, and his only desire was to remain quietly on his estate in the bosom of his family. He addressed the peasants from the balcony. "My children, what have you done? How can you possibly hope to resist the troops of the Republic?" He pointed out the irreparable harm that a civil war would cause, and stressed that they were men with no military experience who would be opposed by regular soldiers. He sent them home to their wives and children, telling them to think of their families, to reconsider their stand, and to come back only if they were truly prepared to die for their cause. The next day, even more men, a huge crowd, appeared at d'Elbée's chateau, insisting upon their willingness to fight and die. When he found that the peasants could not be shaken from their purpose, he made them promise to act as men of resolution and stout heart, and never to lay down their arms until they had cast off the yoke of the Republic. Then forthwith he led them to the town of Beaucréau. His first task was to ensure that no harm came to the Republican prisoners, one of whom later described d'Elbée as a friend of humanity who never shed blood unnecessarily and was always opposed to the murder of prisoners. But on the 11th of April 1793, it seemed there was nothing that d'Elbée could do. His men were determined to make the blue prisoners pay for the massacre at Barret. 500 of these prisoners were held inside the church of Saint-Pierre-et-Chemier. d'Elbée stood on the steps of the church, interposing himself between his men and the prisoners. He pointed out that if Catholics behaved as brutally as Republicans, they might just as well be Republicans. He begged the peasants to show mercy, but they replied that no mercy had been shown at Barret. As a last resort, d'Elbée begged his men to at least kneel down and say one Pater Noster before carrying out their dreadful resolution. The peasants removed their hats and knelt down. When they reached the words, "Forgive us our trespasses," d'Elbée ordered them to stop. "Do you dare to mention God?" he cried. "You are asking him to forgive you in the same way that you pardon others." The lesson was obvious to the Catholic peasants. 500 blue prisoners were saved. And a few days ago, Dr. Tom and I were standing on the very steps where d'Elbée stood to say this famous Pater. It's called the Pater of d'Elbée. After the death of Catalino, d'Elbée was appointed Generalissimo of the Catholic and Royal Army in July 1793. He was badly wounded at the Battle of Cholet on the 17th of October 1793, when a Vendéan army of 35,000 men was defeated in a ferocious battle by a Republican army of 32,000 elite regular troops. The Republican General Kléber, who came from Alsace, paid a tribute to the courage of the Vendéans, who fought, he said, like tigers. d'Elbée received 13 wounds from which he did not recover. When he was captured by the Blues on the island of Noirmoutier in January 1794, he was still too weak to stand. On the 7th of January, displaying the courage expected of a Vendéan general, Maurice d'Elbée faced the firing squad seated upon an armchair, which can still be seen in the museum of the nearby chateau. On the 10th of March 1793, it was announced that as not a single volunteer for the Republican Army had been forthcoming from the district of Saint-Florent-l'Évêque, lots would be drawn on Tuesday the 12th of March. When Tuesday came, the town was invaded by 2,000 armed peasants wearing the right royalist cockades in their hats. They were opposed by only a handful of gendarmes and 200 poorly armed National Guardsmen. Spokesmen for the peasants, the mayors of Saint-Florent and two neighbouring towns, demanded that there should be no drawing of lots and that the Republican troops should lay down their arms. Republican speakers opposed the proposal. A shot rang out and a Republican speaker fell mortally wounded. The National Guard opened fire on the crowd, killing or wounding almost 40 of them. The enraged peasants fell upon the guards, crying, "Vive le roi!" and "Vive les prêtres!" Long live the priests. The Republican officials joined the flight, and triumphant peasants first looted and then burned their offices. The guardsmen panicked, threw down their weapons and fled. The die had been cast. What they now needed was someone to lead them, and there could be only one possibility: Artus Marquis de Bonchon. The Marquis had served as an officer in India, rising to the rank of major in the Régiment d'Aquitaine. He refused to take the oath of loyalty to the convention, resigned his commission, retired from the army in 1789, and went to live at the Château of La Baronnière near Saint-Florent-le-Vieil. On the 13th of March 1793, Bonchon reluctantly agreed to lead the peasants of his district. He warned them of the consequences of going to war against the Republican government, but they were adamant. Bonchon was recognized as an outstanding general even by the Republicans, but he is best remembered for his famous pardon. Like Delbey, he was wounded at the Battle of Cholet. In Bonchon's case, the wound was fatal. The defeated Vendeans retreated across the Loire with artillery, ox carts and animals. The crossing, which began on the night of the 17th of October 1793 and lasted 48 hours, was almost miraculous. Some years later, Napoleon expressed his astonishment at the scale of the achievement. 80,000 made the crossing, of whom less than half were fighting men. The rest were women, children, old men and prisoners, 5,000 of them. It was evidently impossible to keep these prisoners during the retreat because, apart from anything else, there was a grave shortage of food. What was to be done with them? The answer was simple and certain. They must be shot. The Catholic soldiers were embittered by their defeat, heartbroken at the news that their beloved general was on his deathbed, and outraged at incessant Republican atrocities. There can have been hardly a single Vendéan who had not lost friends, relations, or family at the hands of the brutal invaders. Furthermore, if the Blues were released, they would soon be rearmed and in the field once more. Not to shoot them would be folly. The dying Bonchon had been ferried across the Loire and taken to Saint-Florent-le-Vieil, where he spent his last hours in the house of Jean Bellion, and this house can still be seen today. He received the news of the intended massacre of the prisoners with horror. The dying general received the last sacraments from his friend, the Abbé Courgeon, curé of La Chapelle, Saint-Florent. His final words were, "I dare to put my trust in God's mercy. I have not fought for human glory. I have not succeeded in restoring the altars and the throne, but I have at least defended them. I have served my God, my king, and my country. I have known how to pardon." Bonchon died shortly before midnight on the 18th of October, 1793. The Republican generals were astonished when they found that in obedience to his orders, their men had been released. They also had the problem of prisoners who had become an encumbrance to them. 29 cartloads of wounded Catholic soldiers. They solved the problem by throwing them all, while still alive, into a reservoir at Viziers. The Abbey Church of Saint-Florent contains the mausoleum of Bonchon, which was declared an historic monument in 1825. The reason is that it is one of the masterpieces of Pierre-Jean David, called David d'Angers, one of the very greatest of all French sculptors. His most celebrated work is the pediment of the Panthéon in Paris. The statue of Bonchon, in David's unmistakable classical style, depicts the dying general in his final agony, dressed in a Roman toga, demanding mercy for the prisoners. Why did this famous sculptor, convinced Republican, decide to carve a monument to a Vendéan general? The answer is that his father was one of the prisoners whose life was saved by Bonchon. Bonchon's final order had been "Grâce aux prisonniers, Bonchon le veut, Bonchon l'ordonne." Mercy for the prisoners. Bonchon wishes it, Bonchon orders it. And on the tomb they have the words "Grâce aux prisonniers." I have a little postcard of that. Oh, here it is, which I'll pass around. Oops, sorry. Right. Still going, I hope. Yeah. Yes. Now I'd like to say a few words Right. I'd like to say a few words about the Catholic and Royal Army. It's more accurate to speak of Vendéan armies rather than a single Vendéan army. The peasants owed their first loyalty to their particular leader, to Catalino, Delbé, Charat, or Monsieur Henri. Each army was composed of men from the same locality, the same village, the same family. Every parish had its own banner, usually a processional banner depicting our Lord, Our Lady, or some local saint. Attempts to adopt a uniform, even for a local army, were never very successful. Even the generals tended towards idiosyncrasy. The distinctive signs of the Catholic soldier, with a long rosary hung around his neck, the Sacred Heart badge pinned upon his coat, and the white cockade attached to his hat. The Catholics were referred to as the Whites, in contrast to the Republican Blues. The great advantage possessed by the Catholic army was its knowledge of the countryside. Their marksmen hid behind hedges, in ditches, in sunken roads, on banks. These marksmen were expert shots as a result of years' experience in hunting. They did not fire volleys in the traditional military style. Each man waited for a target and took individual aim. Almost every shot that was fired found its mark. Blues by the dozen would fall without even knowing where the balls that killed them came from. When reproached for his defeat at the Battle of Corfu, the Republican General Kleber replied, "It is easy for you to talk, but those devils in sabots, that's clogs, those devils in sabots fight as well as we do and shoot better." When the Blues counterattacked, the Whites might disappear into the countryside, to appear again a few miles down the road. They would eventually attack, crying, "Vive la religion, vive le roi," and a ferocious hand-to-hand combat would ensue. In pitched battles, they would employ the tactic known as le grand choc, the great shock or charge. Instead of advancing upon the enemy in disciplined ranks, they would break ranks and fling themselves upon the enemy, screaming out their battle cry of "Romba, Romba." It is hardly surprising that the Republicans sometimes fled without resistance at what seemed to be a vast tide of steel sweeping towards them. Battles in which this tactic was employed were referred to by the Vendéans as shock, the most famous being the Grand Choc of Chaumier on the 11th of April, 1793. The great weakness of the Catholic army was its lack of discipline, its tendency to drift back home after a victory. The Catholic and Royal Army sometimes numbered as many as 80,000 men, but within 2 or 3 days of a victory, the vast majority might have returned home. The soldiers had farms to manage and families to feed. They felt obliged to hurry back to them after a successful battle. They would say to their commanders, "Je dois changer ma chemise, I must change my shirt," meaning I have to go back to my family for a while. It would be confusing to go through the long list of battles, some of which the Vendéans won and some of which they lost. But mention must be made of the attempt to capture the key city of Nantes, which they could have taken easily earlier in the campaign. On the 29th of June 1793, a concerted attack was made by 4 Catholic armies. But they were fighting outside their natural environment, engaged in formal warfare against professional soldiers defending a well-fortified city. There was also a lack of coordination among the 4 armies, in which personal rivalries may have played a part. The attack was repulsed, which was not in itself a disaster, as the armies retreated in good order. But what was a disaster was the fact that Catalino, the Saint of Anjou, Generalissimo of the Catholic and Royal Army, was fatally wounded. He died at Saint-Florent-l'Évêché on the 14th of July 1793, aged 34 years. The loss of the leader, who had done more than any other individual to build up what had become known as the Army of the Sacred Heart, had a devastating effect upon the morale of his followers. The elite troops of the Republican Army were an invincible force of 20,000 battle-hardened veterans known as the Mayence. They were all professional soldiers who had previously fought in the French Royal Army. They had captured the electorate of Mainz, or Mayence in Germany, during the campaign of 1792, and had won well-deserved glory in defending it against the Prussian army in July 1793. Although eventually obliged to capitulate, these tough soldiers had been granted the honors of war by the Prussians and were repatriated on condition that they did not fight in the line again for 1 year. The National Convention, which had replaced the General Assembly, wished to end the war in the Vendée as quickly as possible, and decided that the most effective means of doing so would be to send in the invincible Mayence under the command of General Jean-Baptiste Kleber, who had commanded them at Mainz. The regiment arrived in Nantes on the 5th of September 1793. On the 19th of September, they confronted the Catholic and Royal Army at Torfou. Kleber left half his men in reserve and attacked the town with 2 battalions. It was defended by the Pedres of Charette. The Pedres were peasants who came from the district called the Pays de Retz, and they're very, very proud of coming from that area. They consider themselves superior not just to the people of the Vendée, but to everyone in France. And they were referred to as the Pedres. The Pedres repulsed the Blues with devastatingly accurate fire from windows, doorways, rooftops, and breaches in the walls. Kleber sent in reinforcements supported by artillery. The town was soon in flames, but the Pedres retreated in good order and continued to decimate the ranks of the Blues from behind every form of natural cover, trees, hedges, banks, and innumerable gorse bushes. Kleber refused to be withstood. He called in more reserves, and in the standard military formation of the period, the entire Mayence army advanced in disciplined ways with fixed bayonets, singing the Marseillaise in step to the beating of their drums, and led by their brave general. It must have been a magnificent sight, rather like when you see Pickett's charge in Gettysburg. They got the heading lines of the drums beating. The result was irresistible. Despite their habitual bravery, the Pedres broke and fled. Mounted on his horse, waving his plumed hat, Charette did all in his power to rally them, but the rout was complete. The Pedres had no thought in mind beyond reaching the bridge over the river Sèvre. But when they did so, they encountered a force which terrified them far more than the Mayence. They met their wives. The women were praying at a calvary near the bridge. All through the Vendée today you see these calvaries, these large stone crucifixes. The women were praying at a calvary near the bridge when their fleeing menfolk appeared. They were outraged by what they considered to be their cowardice, not knowing that for hours their husbands had withstood the finest troops in the French army, who vastly outnumbered them. The women blocked the path of the fugitives, then flung themselves upon the men, attacking them verbally and physically. The men were accused of being shameless, of not being men at all. They were stoned, struck with sticks, and their weapons torn from their hands. If the men were not concerned with the honour of the Pays de Retz, the women were. They would go and fight in place of their men. The Pedres had no choice. At once, as one man, they turned and made for Torfou. Kleber had imagined that he only had Charette to deal with, but when the Pedres fled, the battle seemed to be over. Then, to his dismay, the army of Anjou, the Angevins, led by Bonchamp, arrived. It was the grand shock to end all grand shocks. Although wounded, Bonchamp insisted upon leaving his stretcher to fight with his men. Now that dirty scoundrel Bonchamp has arrived, snarled Kleber. We are completely... his comment was unprintable. He meant things are difficult for us. So as he said, now that dirty scoundrel Bonchamp has arrived, we are completely... beep! Right. Delbé also led his troops into the attack, as did the Marquis de Lescure. Charette and the Pedres returned. Kleber's army was engulfed in the tide of Vendains. Kleber made heroic efforts to rally his men, waving his tricolor beplumed hat in the manner of Charette. One historian of the war remarked, each hero was worthy of the other, but his efforts were fruitless. The Mayence, who had retreated before no army in Europe, were forced to leave the field. Some accounts claim that they fled in panic, throwing away their weapons. Others that they retreated in good order, kneeling and firing volleys every 30 paces. The amount of booty taken by the Vendains was enormous. Cannon, mortars, ammunition wagons, Republican money. But where the Vendains were concerned, only one thing mattered. The invincible Mayence had been routed, and they had routed them. François-Joseph Westermann, known as the Butcher of the Vendée, like Kleber, was also a native of the Alsace. He came from a noble and very Catholic family, but became a ferocious revolutionary and a disciple of Danton. Westermann won what proved to be the decisive battle of the war at Savigny on the 23rd of December 1793. The Catholics were outnumbered by 4 to 1. Time and again they attacked the Blue Battalions in heroic but hopeless charges. As many as 6,000 Catholic prisoners were massacred after the battle. Many of them were women, of whom a great number carried babies in their wombs. One wonders how anyone raised as a Catholic could have written the gloating report that Westermann sent to the Committee of Public Safety in Paris. This is what he wrote. The Vendée no longer exists. It died beneath our sabres with its women and its children. I have buried it in the swamps and woods of Savonay. I crushed the children beneath the hooves of my horses and massacred the women. I do not have one prisoner to reproach myself with. I have exterminated them all. The roads are littered with corpses. Kleber and Marceau were not there. We took no prisoners. It was necessary to feed them with the bread of liberty, and pity is not a revolutionary sentiment. Westermann cannot have realized how true these words were, and when Danton fell in 1794, Westermann followed his mentor to the guillotine. Pity is indeed not a revolutionary sentiment. After Savigny, the Catholic and Royal Army had ceased to exist, but Westermann was premature in stating that the Vendée no longer existed. In the west of the country, there were still men willing to give their lives for religion and the king, despite the terrible price that had been paid. 50,000 Catholics and as many Republicans had already died. Scarcely one peasant out of every 10 who left his village to fight for religion, and the good king returned. Now I want to tell you about the Infernal Columns, which is a really terrible story. It's reputed to be the first organized act of genocide in the history of the world. The terror unleashed upon the Catholics of the Vendée was certainly unparalleled until the advent of Stalin and Hitler. It was the ultimate manifestation of Saint-Just dictum was that the Republic consists of the extermination of everything which opposes it. This policy was carried out throughout the whole Vendée. The prisoners were just massacred everywhere without mercy. Thousands of prisoners were captured and put in the prisons of the city of Nantes. And these prisons were almost literally bursting with Catholics. They all had 3 or 4 times the number for which they'd been built. The squalor and the suffering this caused cannot be imagined. Old and young, men and women and children were all crammed together in conditions devoid of the minimum requirements of decency, sanitation, or hygiene. Epidemics caused hundreds of deaths each day. Some bodies were thrown into the river Loire. Others were left in the prison cells to decompose among the barely living. Republican doctors who visited the prison made known their horror at what they found. The Republican excuse was that the guillotine could not eliminate the enemies of liberty at a sufficiently swift and economic rate. I mentioned to you this morning about the representatives on mission who were sent throughout the country to implement the revolution, and the bestial Jean-Baptiste Carrier was appointed representative on mission at Nantes on the 23rd of September 1793, and was invested with powers which gave him carte blanche to adopt any measures that he saw fit to deal with counter-revolutionaries. The measure that he saw fit to overcome the problem of prison overcrowding was to initiate the notorious drownings of Nantes, Les Noyades de Nantes. Prisoners, tied together in pairs, were placed in flat-bottomed barges. Holes were drilled in the sides and boarded over until the barges reached the middle of the river, when the executioner boatmen would remove the boards and jump into boats that were alongside, from which they watched their victims drown. These drownings were at first confined to priests and carried out surreptitiously at night, beginning with 90 priests on the 19th of November 1793. But they soon took place in broad daylight and were regarded as a form of public entertainment. At least 5,000 Catholics, priests, old men, young men, women and children were tied together 2 by 2, taken out into the River Loire in boatloads and drowned. The most depraved refinement of the drownings was the so-called mariage républicain, the Republican marriage, in which a man and a woman would be stripped naked, tied together, ridiculed, and then thrown into the Loire. There could hardly have been a more sadistic way to humiliate devout Catholics. The Loire was referred to by Republican humorists as the baignoire nationale, the national swimming pool, and the drownings were termed baptême patriotique, patriotic baptisms. Republicans remarked that even though the brigands, they referred to the Catholics as brigands, even though the brigands had complained while in prison that they were dying of hunger, those placed in the barges could hardly complain that they were dying of thirst. Carrier objected to trials as a waste of time. The very fact of being arrested must be considered proof of guilt. All these suspects, he commanded a judge, must be eliminated in a couple of hours, or I will have you and your colleagues shot. Carrier himself perished on the guillotine in December 1794, 2 months after the fall of Robespierre. The conventions decided that the Vendéens must be exterminated and every trace of their ever having existed eradicated from the face of the earth. And they did this, as I mentioned, by the infernal columns. General Turreau, yet another aristocrat who had embraced the revolution, was sent to the Vendée in January 1794 with these infernal columns. He referred to the Vendéens contemptuously as soldiers of Jesus. His assignment was to kill every living human being, irrespective of sex or age, and to burn and destroy every sign of human habitation. Turreau commanded 6 divisions, and each division was divided into 2 columns, and the commanders of the columns vied with each other in their sadism and their violence. Even citizens who were known to be Republicans were referred to as patriots. Even citizens known to be Republicans who were found in Catholic villages were not to be spared. An order of the day read, "I order you to burn all that can be burned, and to bayonet every human being that you encounter." I know that there are some patriots in this country, but it cannot be helped. We must sacrifice everything. There was no level of brutality to which the infernal columns did not descend. Orders were given to conserve powder by killing with the saber rather than the gun. Women were raped as a matter of routine. Children were butchered and the bodies mutilated. Soldiers would tear unborn babies from the wombs of their mothers and carry them in triumph, still living on the points of their bayonets. Babies were taken from their cradles and cut in two with one blow of a saber. Women and children were thrown alive into a red-hot furnace. At Parc-sous-Birs near Mouchon, the chateau was burned to the ground, as were all the chateaux in the path of the infernal columns. 250 villagers were shot there, irrespective of age and sex. The bodies burned on a huge pyre and then thrown into a well of the chateau. At Gonard, 200 mothers, children, and old people were forced to dig a trench into which they tumbled as they were shot. At least 30 women and 2 children were still living when the trench was filled with earth. Every form of food was destroyed. Crops in the field, grain in barns, animals in their sheds. Any Catholic who escaped the columns was intended to die a lingering death from starvation. Needless to say, every church in the path of the columns was first profaned and then looted. The date of the 28th of February 1794 is particularly notorious in the history of the revolution for the massacre of Les Lucs, 2 villages, Le Grand Luc, the Big Luc, and Le Petit Luc, the Little Luc. All the inhabitants of both villages and the surrounding hamlets were systematically butchered. Hundreds fled to take refuge in the church of Le Petit Luc. Those who could not enter knelt outside praying the rosary. The 70-year-old curé, the Abbé Voineau, like a true good shepherd, interposed himself between the blues and his flock, appealing to whatever vestige of humanity might remain in these monsters. They tortured him and then murdered him in the sight of his parishioners. The blues then fired upon the church and on those outside with their cannon. The church collapsed upon the dead, the dying, and the wounded. 564 Catholics died that day, of whom 110 were children of less than 7 years of age. A true massacre of the innocents at Bethlehem in the Vendée. All the atrocities that I've described so far were perpetrated in the name of liberty, equality, and most ironic of all, fraternity. And a few weeks ago I was present with Tom and Dr. Bob in the church of Le Petit Luc, where you can go and see, and they have a list of all these people who were murdered in this massacre. You'll see a family, like say, Monsieur Bonchon, age 47, Madame Louise Bonchon, age 45, Denise Bonchon, age 17, Charles Bonchon, age 13, Marie Bonchon, age 9, and then you see perhaps, Robert Bonchon, 4 days old. And they're all there in plaques on the wall. I've got a photograph you can see a little later if you like to, that Dr. Bob took. The infernal columns were intended to break the spirit of the Vendéens, but they had precisely the opposite effect. Most of the leaders of the Vendéans had retreated with small groups of followers into the interior of the Vendée. Although they were no longer in a position to mount assaults on towns or cities, they were able to act very effectively as guerrillas. Shots would ring out from nowhere, soldiers from a column would fall wounded or dead, and those who shot them would not be seen and could not be found. When the Blues lay down to sleep at night, they did not know whether they would live to see the morning. Charette was particularly active. Success increased the numbers of his men, and an entire infernal column was routed. But there was no more talk of mercy for prisoners or the wounded. Hymns and the rosary were no longer heard. The Catholic soldiers were motivated by a cold fury and the desire for revenge. In a daring raid upon the town of Chimier, another Vendéan general, Monsieur Henry, put 600 Republican troops to flight and liberated 600 women who were on the point of being shot. The principal target of the Republicans was now Charette. General Axo was sent with 20,000 well-armed men to apprehend him. Axo promised the Committee of Public Safety that, in 6 weeks, I will send you the head of Charette, or I will lose my own. On the 20th of March 1794, Axo divided his forces into 4 columns and attacked the much smaller force of Charette. The Catholics fell upon the Blues with a terrible fury and drove them back. Axo, a brave and skillful soldier, rallied his men and counterattacked on 6 occasions, but eventually fell wounded from his horse. He struggled to his feet, put his back to a tree, and with drawn sword and great courage, he faced the Catholics who surrounded him. Axo was killed without mercy. Charette remarked, "How sad to have killed so brave a man," and he wept. Axo, the pride of the Republicans, was buried where he fell. In the autumn of 1794, with a force that rarely numbered more than 700 men, Charette won a series of brilliant victories. He became known as the King of the Vendée, and the convention was furious. The tactic of the infernal columns had not achieved its objectives and was abandoned. An attempt was made at conciliation. An amnesty was offered to all who had laid down their arms, with the exception of the non-juring priests. 900 prisoners were liberated at Nantes, 83 at Seymour, and 50 at Angers and Rochefort. Republican delegates made contact with the Vendéan leaders. All that they needed to do, the Republicans said, was to recognize the Republic, and everything to be arranged. The kings of Europe have now recognized the Republic, Charette was assured, and he replied, "That may be true, but they are not Vendéans." The Republican General Hoche was given command of all the Republican forces in the Vendée. Hoche was a prudent man, and he was determined to get a lasting peace, and he was wise enough to realize that this could best be done to the non-juring priests. He explained to his officers, "As priests, their nature is naturally inclined towards peace. With a little tact, we can use them as a means of pacifying the region. Send officers and soldiers to assist their masses. When you meet the peasants, speak to them reverently of God." The Republican generals followed these orders, and some of the soldiers even went to the extent of helping the non-juring priests to repair and reopen their churches. What a paradox of history! The very soldiers who had been torturing priests and profaning tabernacles a few months before were now behaving as if they were faithful Catholics. Some even acted as sacristans, but the tactic worked. The non-juring priests continued to refuse to take the oath of loyalty to the Republic, but they no longer preached against it. The new policy of religious tolerance was not confined to the Vendée. But what must be understood here, though, was that Hoche wasn't doing this for any kind of humanitarian reason. It was simply to get peace so that his troops could be taken to fight the external enemies of France. Whether they were aware of it or not, Catholics in Paris and throughout France ordered the restoration of their right to public worship to the martyrs of the Vendée. The Catholic revival gained such momentum throughout the whole of France that by the end of 1796, the Republican General Clark lamented, "Our revolution, so far as religion is concerned, has proved a complete failure. France has become once more Roman Catholic." Simon Scarman in his book remarks that The Enlightenment cliché of a steadily secularizing France completely fails to take account of just how deeply rooted the hold of Christian belief was in very large areas of France. Of all the failures of the French Revolution, none would be so inevitable and so dismissal as the campaign of de-Christianization. Hoche had pacified the Vendée with one exception, Charette, and it was essential to eliminate him, cost what it may. Hoche's program of conciliation was proving so successful that only 1,000 men remained with Charette. Surrender your arms, urged Hoche. Rebuild your homes, cultivate your farms, pray to God. You will be left in peace. This was tempting advice, particularly because it was evident that Hoche meant what he said. He meant it not from any sympathy with the Vendéan cause, but because peace in the Vendée was essential for the Republican cause. The deciding factors where most of the peasants were concerned was the advice of their good priest, the non-jurors, to abandon the armed struggle. But under no circumstances was Charette willing to allow Hoche to consider him a spent force. He made a series of daring attacks upon the Blues, and to the consternation of Hoche, Charette was victorious on each occasion. Although these victories were gained in what were no more than skirmishes, it was no less galling for the Republican general. On the 4th of December, Charette made a successful attack upon a Republican camp and won his final victory. Hoche was no longer willing to negotiate with him. Secure in the knowledge that his policy of conciliation had ruled out any possibility of a further popular rising, he decided to track down the king of the Vendée and eliminate him. With each day that passed, Charette's faithful remnant dwindled to 300 and then to 200. They were hounded unceasingly by the Blues. Hoche decided that after all, he would make one more attempt to negotiate a settlement. If Charette agreed to leave the Vendée, his life would be spared. Charette replied, "I shall conquer or die for my God and my King. That is my resolve. It will never change." Hoche now devoted all his energies to hunting down Charette. In his divisional orders he wrote, "Give him no rest, use any form of deceit, but arrest Charette." Only a pitiful remnant of his supporters now remained with the king of the Vendée. They numbered no more than a few dozen. In a skirmish on the 8th of March 1796, they lost their remaining horses. Weakened by hunger and fatigue, drenched by ceaseless rain, frozen to the marrow, thin, foul-smelling, they struggled along paths of ankle-deep mud, which made every step a painful effort. Hoche had withdrawn 4 columns of his best troops from every duty but hunting down Charette. On the 23rd of March, Charette and his remaining handful of followers were hemmed in by 3 of the columns, but Charette would still not surrender. They fought throughout the day, their numbers dwindling as the Blues picked them off one by one. Charette's faithful bodyguard, Pfeiffer, received a fatal wound. He cried out as he died, "I am Charette." The Blues were not deceived, and the pursuit intensified. Charette was now completely trapped in a forest. Again and again he tried to find a way out that was not guarded, but it was of no avail. The Blues came upon him at last and opened fire immediately. A musket ball lodged in his shoulder, but he continued to fight. A Blue officer slashed at him with his sword and cut 3 fingers from his left hand. "Where is Charette?" the officer demanded. "He is here," was the reply. Charette had been taken. He was taken to the Château of La Charbotterie and laid upon the kitchen table for attention to his wounds. The Catholic general was to be shot, and he must not be allowed to die before his execution. The table upon which he lay can be seen today in the kitchen of La Charbotterie, which is now part museum and part shrine to the heroes of the Vendée. And once again, Dr. Bob and Tom and I were there a few weeks ago, and we saw this table. Charette was taken to Angers and was received with great courtesy by General Edouville, who asked why he took up arms when the Republic had offered peace, and he said because the Republic could not be trusted to keep its promises. Posters were printed announcing that Charette had been captured. He was taken to Nantes on the 28th of March and paraded through the streets to convince the inhabitants that he really had been taken. On the same day he was condemned to be shot, and the sentence was carried out. He asked for a non-juring priest to hear his confession, but the request was refused. He was, however, promised that on his way to execution he would see a priest who was a friend. Charette made a 2-hour confession to a juring priest, the Abbé Guibert, who accompanied him to his execution. The non-juring priest, l'Abbé Gergaud, was on the route as promised. Charette paused before him, bowed his head, and received his absolution. There's a beautiful picture of that done by Tom in my book. When Charette arrived at the place of execution, he embraced his confessor, recited an act of contrition aloud, refused a blindfold, and said that he would give the sign to fire himself by lowering his head. Charette stood to attention, his head held high. Pointing to his heart, he called out to the picket, "Soldiers, aim there! It is here that you must strike the heart of a brave man. Vive le roi!" Slowly and deliberately he lowered his head. A moment's pause. A volley rang out. He received 5 balls in the chest, remained upright for a moment, and then slid slowly to the ground. The Chevalier François Athanase Charette de la Contrie, General of the Catholic and Royal Army, was dead. He was 33 years old. The sacrifices made by the Vendéens brought freedom to the church throughout France. These sacrifices had been enormous and had been borne by every section of Vendéan society, from the very old to unborn babies in the womb. The historian Renaud Séché has termed the Republican reprisals as an act of genocide. Between 250,000 and 300,000 Vendéens died, together with a vast number of Republican troops. The true extent of the Republican losses was never revealed. Not all the Vendéens who died were killed in the fighting or the massacres. Thousands died as a result of the hardship, penury, and epidemics resulting from the war. The granting of complete religious freedom for all French Catholics was the final act in the last crusade, the War of the Giants. It was Napoleon himself who had described the Vendéens as such. They were giants who saved the honor of Catholic France. They were giants whose enormous sacrifices show the extent to which every Catholic should go to uphold his faith to the very limit and beyond. They were giants who realized that the only victory that matters is that of doing what we know to be right, cost what it may. The last words of Bonchon, which I've already quoted to you, should inspire every Catholic who loves the faith to emulate him. I have not fought for human glory. I have not succeeded in restoring the altars and the throne, but I have at least defended them.